Okay, welcome. My name is Steve Hughes, and I'm going to take some time now to show you how to do a diagrammatic perspective drawing. You may know it by constructive or analytical drawing. It's using geometric shape, it's using larger box forms to break down something more complex like this takeout container. Now the drawing I'm going to do is going to be a little quicker, a little looser than the one that I've laid out down below. It'll be a slightly different perspective as well. So to begin with, it's based off of a cube. We're going to be looking at what makes something complicated a little bit easier to draw. And most of that begins with something geometric, and the cube being pretty close to what's happening with this takeout container. Starting with the front corner, the corner that's hitting the surface of the table, I'm also looking at, with some perspective here, the gap between a first angle here and a first angle right here. I'm looking at a straight line underneath it to better assess these angles. And at this point I have not made a measurement to determine scale or proportion. And so this first height line is what's going to set everything else in motion. Right now I'm just double checking my angles and correcting things as they present an error. So at this point I'm thinking about linear perspective, where anything that we can identify as being parallel on the subject, when we view it turned into perspective, turned into space, there will be foreshortening involved that will create some convergence visible on the page. So we're trying to, with these diagrammatic lines, think through the form, take these lines longer than they really need to be. That way you're ensuring that they do converge in space. It's very easy to get to the point where they look parallel on the paper as well and don't actually convey that recession of space and depth. So it is vitally important that we take these lines further than they need to go. And before I go any further, I'm just going to keep making evaluations to correct and bring a little bit more clarity to the marks that I've made. So try to avoid leaving sketch lines that are going to interfere with what you're looking at and how you're reading the subject. So at this point I have a height. I need to determine the width on both sides. If you're familiar with takeout containers, usually you can find that they are a little bit longer on one side, a little shorter on the other side. So in this particular case, this side is going to be a little bit wider, this side is going to be a little narrower. So I'm using sighting technique by measuring the width this direction against the height in front of me. And I can tell that it goes about up to there on that width. So I'll make a first little notation there and use this as a beginning point. I am trying to use long lines, drawing with the whole arm, not necessarily just my wrist or my fingertips flicking, trying to get something that's relatively straight without using a ruler in this particular case. So I'm flicking my eyes back and forth between the subject and seeing that I think I need it to be a little shorter in width, so I'll make that edit, change it up. As you would have other subjects or objects maybe laid out in a still life, it's useful to have these extra lines extending because they can help you establish whether there's an implied compositional alignment that you can make from this angle on the box, or maybe the lines going back this direction. It may line up with something down the road on your still life. So again, I've made a little notation here for where I believe that right side is going to conclude. And I'm looking at that angle up in front of me and trying to measure it. Going back and forth. The front edge also will have a little bit of an angle, so it's something I can kind of clarify a little bit here and clean up the original corner just a bit. It's not quite straight when I measure a plumb line or a perfect straight line drop from my pencil. It's just a little off. Okay. So once I'm happy generally with this proportion, the measurement of the angles underneath as a kind of negative space or ground space between the figure, I'll be continually assessing this kind of concept throughout the process, drawing the space behind something or between shapes just as much as I'm actually drawing the box or the flaps. Continuing to remember convergence of parallel lines happening here, so everything that you can identify as being parallel will appear to recede back into space to a common vanishing point on our eye level. This is really easily helped by having those lines extend. If you see one line's going to cross the next before all the parallel lines meet at one point, then you're in trouble. You'll need to make an assessment. You'll need to make a revision to that. Okay, I'm pretty happy with these angles, but I always like to double check this angle. Measuring that on my still life up here in front of me and bringing that angle down here and making sure that it's nearly the same. You can also look at the one horizontally, but this is a little bit better of an assessment for me because we can tell for sure immediately whether it's to the left of this or to the right of it, and then the angle, is a nice double check. Alright, the last thing I want to do, just to continue thinking this through as a construction, is just very faintly rough in as if the box were transparent. You may not always need this information, but it can be useful for planning stages on other parts, which are going to be the side planes where there might be a flap attaching and we need to find a symmetry line. So we've got a base shape. We start building off the complexity from this base shape. All the flaps have a continuation of the plane on all the four sides. I'm going to start with the back flap. Sometimes there's a little bit of an angle shift, but for the moment it is pretty continuous with the plane edges and goes up straight at a slight angle potentially. But I'm going to figure out now the height of that flap relative to something that I've already measured, say the front edge, and I'll put a mark as a guesstimation. Lay that angle in there. Again, it's going back into space to the same vanishing points that I've already laid out on the right side. Now I'm just going to double check it against a different proportion and see, maybe I want it a little shorter. Going to keep keep assessing until I'm happy and confident with it. Because there's a lot of human error here. I'm not necessarily measuring it with a ruler like that. That mark, put it right there. Do one more measurement and then make a judgment call. Okay, I'm going to just lower it to that second mark a little bit and erase what's unnecessary. That way I'm not confused in the sketching process. Now I'm going to do this on all the flaps first, building from simple rectilinear shape first into the more complex forms that I might see. So, parallel edges. Those four right now, we got to ensure that this line converges back to the same vanishing point that these guys on the left side are going to. Alright, the front edge, might have to do a little measuring to get this one to work. These edges here somewhat overlap. Don't be confused with this line, which looks like it completes it already. That's a good idea of something as a relationship I can use to make the judgment for the height. Because if this line is extended and I hold my pencil measured across it, I can tell that the flap in front is just a little bit below it, and it helps me achieve that angle without a lot of measuring. Okay, so one more flap here. All four of them are lifted up, just like that back edge here allowed me to assess the front right flap. This back edge here will help me assess the front one. And it is just a little bit closer to equal compared to the other one. Okay, so now a lot of these flap shapes will have parts chiseled off of them, cut off of them. There's a tab that inserts into one of the other flaps that we'll deal with here in a second. Alright, we're ready to take the midpoint and build from it. So within this flap, I'm going to find the exact center point. So by taking corner to corner and drawing a line through it, we're able to find the exact midpoint as it would be projected into space. So with linear perspective, as you shift that plane into perspective, into the space, away from your picture plane, you're going to find that if this was an even measure, as you move it back into space, I take this little piece here, and we compare, you can see it's about 1/4 of an inch shorter now. So we find in linear perspective that at an equal distance, as it's viewed in space again and again and again, receding back, will diminish in scale. So this X marks the spot, finds the midpoint. That allows me to better evaluate how this flap is going to be constructed. I need to put the point of the flap connected to that midpoint. Now the point is it's squared off, but it does need to happen around that midpoint. And knowing that this is wider in the front, narrower in the back distance, I try to do that here as well. This little distance from there to there is just a little bit bigger than from here to here. And I'm looking at a side view, straight on the side view, to kind of assess where is the midpoint where the flap is going to get sort of clipped off. So I'm looking at a line drawn from one side to the other, so I ensure that the corners where this is going to happen line up. And just like this was wider in the front, narrower behind, this is taller in front, and this is shorter behind. That's equal distance, but because it's turned into space, it looks smaller as it goes back into space. So literally now it's point A to B, back and forth. Just connect the dots. And you evaluate whether that's what it looks like up in front of you. So one of the things I'm really assessing is, what is this angle? What does this shape kind of look like compared to that one? You can see those triangles are not quite the same in shape. And if you're happy with it, keep moving. Otherwise, make an adjustment. Now I'm drawing this by hand, so I'm always trying to be vigilant and clean up the marks as best I can. That means redrawing lines until it's relatively straight or hitting the mark. So I found my midpoint again and brought that center point up. Give it a little bit of distance in front, a little bit behind. And whatever I've sort of assessed as the amount that I'm dropping it below that midpoint here, I want to make that relatively consistent, as if those lines could come to a corner right there. It's important to remember that this line is parallel to the top and bottom edges of this flap, so it does need to maintain convergence with those lines back to the same vanishing point. That's important because if this corner dropped a little too low, or if this dropped a little too high, or raised a little too high, it's going to look just a little bit off in perspective. Okay. I'll save the back flap for last if there's a little bit more time. This has the tab that inserts into this flap. I haven't laid in the little insertion point, but that happens right about here. A little bit of angle, a little thickness. So there's a little tab. Now there's a lot of overlapping lines here. Bear with me. I may even sort of shift to a different color just for some of this. Okay, find the X. Take the midpoint. That's about where the top of the tab hits. Just hits a little bit to the right of that. And there's sort of equal thirds that I like to break this up into. Now once again, these are all parallel. They're not exactly thirds in my drawing now, but it's close enough. They converge, remember? So we're trying to get those to go back into space to the same vanishing point as parallel lines should in perspective. Alright, now from here, just like on these sides here, there's a relationship where it's going to cut and feel cut off. Now I don't have a quick, easy way to kind of figure out where this next corner goes, but I'm going to take the angle from what I'm sitting at and looking on the subject, bring that angle up. Now since these are guesstimates here, these third measures, one of the things I'm going to look at is the corner relationship relative to something else, perhaps vertically. Where does it fall relative to the front corner. And I'm kind of finding this is part of the diagrammatic process. It's looking for other relationships to help coordinate where something lands. So those two kind of lines would cross right about there. I don't necessarily always like to find just one, but also take another relationship from something else. And sometimes you search for it, you hunt for it. It's in this general area. So I'm going to go with where it is at the moment. Bring it this direction. Another relationship I'm looking at, this corner to the shape that kind of die cuts around. And we get kind of a half circle started over here. And I was mentioning that it just touches the top just a little bit behind the midway point. Continues out. It's not a complete circle now. It's literally connect the dots. There may be a little curvature based on the wear and tear of the box, but I'm using the big rectilinear form to break it down into smaller parts to make it easier, kind of like projecting from a gridded drawing onto a larger canvas. Okay, we'll move on to the front flap, which has a definite need to divide again and locate the midpoint. Now, I think it's just a little off, so I'll move that over a little bit. I'm guessing it's right there. I'm also going to look at the base. As a helpful measure down here. So I'm trying to divide then this into two as well. And bring this relationship up. So a little off there, I think. I like that better. So this space looks like it's a little larger still. And from that idea, the flaps that attach to this end up giving it a bow. There's a little curvature to it. So I'm thinking about pushing that forward in space. I'm going to say it's right about there. So I'm trying to evaluate the depth that it actually curves to. And sometimes you gotta look straight down on your subject to make sure that it's bowing as much as you're seeing. So point A, point B, point C, we curve between them. Widest point of the curve right there. And what happens is essentially I've recast the midpoint for part of this. So we have this extra gap or this space that I'm looking at, this triangular distance between things. So it's recast the midpoint for the handle attachment. That gives me something else to look at. Point A to the handle attachment, I'm going to call it right there. That I can then bring flap construction around it. I get a nice sliced edge coming to a point here. Bring it down to the back corner. And just this little bit actually happens on the curvature. It's the only little bit. This would all be erased out. Looking at a relationship here to figure out where this corner happens on this other side, and then taking an angle measurement to establish that direction, tracing over the curvature there, giving it a little thickness since there's multiple layers of cardboard built up there. Looking at a vertical drop to find a relationship to see where this line would connect to the base. Draw the base in there now. And I've started to lay everything in now in blue, so maybe go through and quickly add a little reality to some things. Sometimes it just needs a little thickness to make that feel like it advances in space just a bit. So cardboard has a little bit more dimension than a piece of paper. It's got to have a little thicker front edge. Alright, that was all in service of helping to locate where this handle placement is. Handle definitely has a thickness. It also has a bow, a little curvature to it. So I'm thinking about that curvature, widest point right there, just pushed further even than it needs to be potentially. It's pretty flexible metal, so there's a lot of wiggle room for kind of error to happen. This is an inclined plane. I'm definitely trying to establish convergence here as well because I'm closer to the distance right here compared to the one back behind it if there was a connection from the insertion point here to the insertion point on the back side. Lay in the thickness, bring that edge in to focus. Front edge is relatively soft as a mark, not a real clean, sharp point, so I'll put that in with a different kind of mark as well. This edge also has a little character to it, meaning it's got a tear or a little extra variation to that edge. Always something I'm looking for to give it a little bit more reality or interest. You know, and at this point, probably could do with a sharper pencil, but we'll carry through. A little edge rip, just a little change to it. All right, now the back flap. Looking at, coming back to my pencil real quick, take the X, bring that a little lower. It's going to be a little more relative to this one. Since I'm doing this in colored pencil over top of this, I'll keep these lines looser. Stand up, definitely make sure that my angles are close to where they need to be. Like that, a little higher. And I'm really trying to look at critically, how does this curve relate to that straight? Does that mean that this just needed to be clipped off in terms of the original rectangle? I'm looking at the negative space, the ground space between these forms, as a double check, a way to really assess that shape. And when I'm happy with it, I'll go in and lay that in, moving it over just a little bit based on that negative space that I'm seeing. A little double thickness to the fold on the inside, and then softer edge. This is shaded a bit with the light source for the moment. So softer edge there makes a lot of sense for me. And that basically does it. Hope you've learned a lot. If there are any issues with linear perspective, I recommend going through some books. The Andrew Loomis series on creative illustration is a great set to look at. And just a quick search for diagrammatic perspective drawings will get you a lot of results on Google. So I hope you learned a lot. Thanks for bearing with me.